And we're live. Assalamu alaikum, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and where you are watching us. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Virginia. You may check about our center and learn about our activities at our website, which is www.contemporaryislam.org. That is contemporaryislam, one word.org. And I will share this link in the chat function of the YouTube. So thank you all who are joining us on YouTube Live. This is an interactive session in a way. So it's another in the series of the CICW book talks. And today we are grateful to have with us Professor Mbaye Lo from Duke University. So welcome, Dr. Lo.
Thank you.
Just a brief introduction. This is, I think, seventh, if I'm not mistaken, in the series of our book talks that we've been doing. They are live on YouTube as you are watching us, and the chat function is live. So you can submit your questions, your comments in the chat function, and we will take those comments when we are done with the first part of the book talk. So the book talk, it has two parts. The first part is when I have a discussion with the author of the book, in this case, Dr. Lo, and then that's going to last for about 30 to 40 minutes, depending how it goes. And then we have about 20 to 30 minutes to engage the audience, you who are watching us from all over the world. And we're going to engage your questions, your comments, and hopefully answer, if not all of them, most of them, depending on the time allocated. So our aim is to finish this within about an hour. But if the discussion gets interesting and we have a lot of questions, we may extend that for a few minutes. So that's about the ballpark of time that you would require for attending this particular talk. So the book in front of us is this book. It's called Political Islam, Justice and Governance, written by Dr. Lo from Duke University. He is an associate professor of practice. He teaches in African and Middle Eastern studies. He also teaches in Arabic language testing, the MSA. He is an expert on political Islam, on the history of Islam in Africa, on Arabic language testing, many other things. And you can access his bio page at the link that I will be providing in the chat very shortly. So with this brief introduction, we are going to immediately delve into the book. And the first question, Dr. Lo, that I always ask our guests is, why did you write this book, and what is its main argument?
Thank you very much, Ermin, for inviting me. This is a great opportunity for me to share my work with your wonderful audience. I am, as you have mentioned, Associate Professor of the Practice at Duke in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and International Comparative Studies. So this area of work is of my priority. Why I write this book, I really don't know. It is a book that I always wanted to write. You know, in the academia, we write books for many reasons, sometimes mostly for academic reasons. But this book is not an academic book, or that wasn't in my mind when I started working on it. I think it is one of my oldest projects. It is a book that I always wanted to write. It is a story that I wanted to tell, because I lived it as a student, international student, and lived it as a professional professor. So it is a story that I wanted to tell. It is about telling the story of Islamists coming to power and trying to give an explanation of their successes and failures. That is why, really, you know, I wrote this book, is to tell the story. Second is, the argument of the book is basically simple. It is basically the argument is about political Islam. So I need to explain to your audience. Here we talk about political Islam. We talk about Islamists, not Muslims. So we should not generalize. That is a key element that I always like to highlight. So Islamists, as represented in these three groups that I studied, Morsi of Egypt, Bashir Turabi of Sudan, and the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, has failed to govern effectively and successfully due to, I argue, the inability to reconcile between a global order framework that cherishes liberty and individual freedom with the understanding of justice, which I call literal justice, which centered on a narrow aspect of what justice is in Islam. So as a result of their failures is, as we have seen, an abject, often tragic outcome in these countries. So the argument, as I just mentioned, is to give context to prior studies of the earlier studies of political Islam, which were generally speculations and postulations. So this book really will give you case studies of political Islamists coming to power and the outcome of their work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that sets the stage pretty well for the next question. But before we turn to the book itself, you mentioned in the acknowledgement that you had an opportunity to study in Sudan, study for a while in Saudi Arabia, to meet Hassan al-Turabi, to meet even briefly Sheikh bin Baz, and other important Muslim scholars and political thinkers of the late 20th, early 21st century. How have these encounters shaped the book and your own intellectual trajectory?
Great point. You're reminding me. I even forgot if I mentioned this in the book. But you are right. In the intro, well, remember when you write a book, as I did in this case, publish it. The only thing you want to do is to move on to the next book. So at times you just don't want to revisit the book because it is exhausting. Writing is exhausting process. That once you get it off your mind and your thought, you just want to move on to the next one. I did not study in Saudi Arabia. I think I talked in the intro about my experience. You remember Mandela, when asked to talk about apartheid, he couldn't give a starting point because that's everything that he knew, basically, in his autobiography. So I was making a similar case about my encounter with political Islam is as old as my training as a scholar itself. So that's what I was talking about. And my sensitivity with literal understanding of Islam is deep into my earlier childhood experience. So I think that in the context as a student, undergraduate student who is not even 17 years old, visiting Saudi Arabia, I think for Umrah, that is how I came to touch with Sheikh Abdul Aziz Ibn Baz. He is one of the most actually effective Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, I think from 1993 till he passed away in 1999. So it just happened that I was invited, taken to have lunch with him. And I think in the book I talk about my meeting with him and how his literal understanding of Islam was at play during that occasion. As of Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi, and these people are good people, may they all rest in peace, I should say, who passed away in 2016. I think he's a global, well-respected scholar who has actually shaped his country positively and negatively in the last 40 years. So I'm a Senegalese, but I got my undergraduate and graduate training in Khartoum before coming to the state for further education. So as a student, I met Turabi. In subsequent years, as a professor, I visit Sudan to do this research. I was also got the opportunity to meet with him. But my first encounter, I think the one I talk about in the book, was my first book that I wrote in Arabic called قضايا اللغة والدين في الأدب الإفريقي. It is about themes of religion and literature in African culture or literature, literary themes in African culture. That's a good translation of it, which looks at just African writers of Arabic background and known tradition and how they see issues of religion. I think the book won a global prize of which was under Turabi's name for outstanding performance. So that was the occasion in which I was invited to meet with him and so on. So I think I talk about that with that in the book. But I wasn't a disciple of either one of these sheikhs. But they work. Bin Baz, something I'm familiar with reading his fatwas. Turabi's work, a very prolific writer, also I'm very familiar with it. So they have helped me over the years have a better understanding of this, different views of Islam from political understanding in the context of Turabi and more Wahhabis, Salafist understanding in the context of Sheikh Abdul Aziz Ibn Baz. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is really useful because it is often, I think, interesting for the readers to understand the intellectual journey that you went through. And even as if as you say, you were not directly a student, you don't consider these scholars your own direct teachers and sheikhs. That there are still some people who have influenced global Islamic discourse, and in one way or another, you have been familiar with their ideas. So this, I think, sets the stage perfectly for now going deeper into the book. In the beginning, I think in the first and second chapter, you talk in the book about the tension between freedom and justice in both contemporary Islamic and Western thought. Can you expand on this a bit?
Right. That is a tough one. Well, I have to admit that I know most of my colleagues in the academia, they dismiss essentialism, but I don't dismiss it. I think there is essentialism in human cultures and tradition. Well, essentialism, as you know, is the view that every entity has a set of attributes that are necessary to its identity. I often, it's something that I think it is always relevant. I know in the American context, we're very unique because it's a multicultural society. But our strength, I think, is in that, amalgamation of many, groups and the specificities coming together. I think that is what makes this country, unique in its talent. But essentialism, I think, is something we in the academic often reject, outright. This has to do with many factors, including Edward Said's Orientalism, in which he essentialized the West as well as, uncovering the West, essentializing the Orient. But this should not dismiss the very fact that essentialism does exist. Communities, cultures have some orientation to some specific skills and understanding. And this is something that James Madison talks, I think, lightly in the Federalist Papers. And even in Muslim tradition, Al-Jahiz believed in essentialism. Al-Jahiz talked about the black, uniqueness in the power of speech, poetry and dance and so on. And a Muslim scholar, I think that was Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, he's a 10th century, talks in his book, Anil, it's a very, very good book, Anil, I forgot the name of the book, but Kitab al-Imta' wal-Mu'anasa. It talks about the same issue of, essentialism. Groups, societies, communities have been offered certain skills and focus on certain values at the expense of others. So that is the framing of my argument, that I think, there is some uniqueness in groups and cultures. So that is the context in which I come to offer a critique of Western thought, liberalism, as historically focusing since the Renaissance on freedom at the expense of justice. Muslim political practices and thought, if you will, also focusing on justice historically at the expense of freedom. That is the argument that I try to build. The first 4 chapters are geared toward building this argument, drawing on classical liberalism, classical work in liberalism, drawing on Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, in looking at up till Milton Friedman's capitalism and freedom. You can always see selective focus on freedom at the expense of justice. Even if you look at if you look at from more philosophical view, from Immanuel Kant to John Rawls, you see focus also is on freedom, not justice. Even if the latter person's book is The Word of Justice, I argue in some way in the book that actually his default setting was freedom. So there is obsession with, in the liberal argument, history and practices, with freedom at the expense of justice. And as a result, we have colonialism, slavery and imperialism. So that is something that I argue extensively in the book. Of course, I did talk about we should not generalize. The focus on freedom was contested through socialism and communism, as well as the African American civil rights tradition. These were movements that call to prioritize justice within the global Western framework. So that is something I pay a lot of attention and link it into the rise of neoliberal policies that were globalized in 1970s. At the center of this argument also is this classical focus on freedom at the expense of justice, played out on focusing on politics versus ethics, which I wrote about in different ways. But currently it's playing out in this contestation between freedom and justice under the neoliberal framework. So it is a very complex argument that I focus on giving example and detailing, looking at the literature and the practices in on a global scene. I also talk in the Muslim context. It is quite challenging because this is an issue that whenever I raise it, my Muslim colleagues have a tendency to be defensive. That Islam also focus on freedom. That is not the argument I'm making here. This is a case study, empirical case studies. That doesn't say Islam doesn't focus on freedom. It's just looking at Muslim practices and polities. That the focus on literal justice has always been happening historically and in modern time at the expense of freedom and liberties. Text matters in Islam because this is the religion of textuality, al-kitab, alif lam mim dhalik al-kitab, as the Quran say. And my colleague will talk about silsila. Everything is about silsila. It's about narrative, about tradition. So it makes sense for us to support our argument based on the written tradition, not based on our, imagination of what could be or what is. So that is the context. I look at the Sheikh Jamal al-Banna, the leading Egyptian scholar, who really was obsessed with studying these issues of, what he called Nazaret al-Adl, looking at the question of justice and freedom in Muslim and Western tradition. And he's one of the leading frameworks that one can use here to frame the debate. And his argument is, if you look at the Quran, actually, freedom is not, political freedom in particular, is not there. Yeah, this is not there. Everything about justice, over 300 times justice mentioned, over 1,000 times vocabularies similar to justice are echoed. So what does that tell us? And so this is just a question that scholars should ponder about. And there are many interviews I talk about in the book with leading scholars, and you can see difficulties of domesticating political freedom itself. Yeah. And I remember my, Professor Hassan in Khartoum in an interview in 2010 that a leading Islamist scholar that al-hurriya laysat min maqasid al-shara, verbatim, political freedom is not one of the objectives of Sharia. I still remember that echoing in my mind. It was just very beautifully, quotation. So I think my argument here is that doesn't diminish Islam at all, because maybe political freedom should be the outcome of justice itself. Yeah, maybe maybe if we get justice right, one of the main outcome of that justice will be political freedom. Likewise, in the West, and that is the argument of the, if one is familiar with the civil rights movement and theory in America, is actually justice should be the outcome of the American freedom. That is, if you're familiar with Obama's writing, that the perfect union is when justice becomes the outcome of this freedom that we promote for years. So that is the argument that we have there. I should also highlight that, and this is something that I discuss in the book. There's a tremendous scholarship in this area that one can just revisit and work more to familiarize oneself with it. But I talk about two writers actually Muslim writers, because there is, who came out, who reached into conclusions that prioritize freedom at the expense of justice. And one of them is Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, the Syrian writer, who passed away, I think, in 1902, and, Professor An-Nu'aymi, great book. These are two works that look at actually despotism in Muslim polities as dictating a new form of political arrangement that should focus on freedom itself. Yeah. You have all the writers, Abdullah al-Arawi, the Moroccan writer, tremendous scholarship, has a book, the concept of freedom. Also, what he's showing is actually political freedom is just not there in Muslim and Arab political tradition. And the only way you can find it actually was in the Bedouin lifestyle. But whenever the Sultan centralized, it was mostly textuality and literal interpretation of Islam. So there is an ongoing debate that really my mind does not stand out, but it is rooted into existing literary tradition of Islam and Muslim scholarship. But one thing I noticed, and that was something I paid attention to specifically in this book, is the absence of the argument for freedom in Islamist modern writing. It is not there. Those who write even call for freedom. Most of them are secularist, what we call lay person Muslims. But in Islamist argument, political freedom is not central to it. So that is one of the key elements that I try to make in this book. Yeah, that is I hope I did answer your questions. Yeah.
No, it's very good. Actually, you anticipated my next question and even answered it, so I can immediately skip it because your answer was very comprehensive and had, in many ways, I think, combined 2 or 3 chapters of the book together, and it sets the stage for the next question that I have for you, which is, you argue in the book that at the very core of political Islam, there is a tension due to its own understanding of justice. So what is this tension you are writing about, and how does it manifest itself in the thinking and practice of political Islam.
Right, right. Well, I often have to reiterate that I'm focusing on political Islam. And I have to go back and say earlier on the book, because I'm assuming most of those who are following us have not read the book. The book is about close to 400 pages. And I made it clear that my focus was the Arabic-speaking world, political Islam in the Arab world. That is the case study that I developed. And I call scholars not to generalize until we have similar cases that look at Islamist polities outside the Arab world, because I focus on the 3 Islamist polities that we had so far in the Arab world, which are the Muslim Brotherhood, who came to power under Morsi for a year, 2012, 2013, June to June. Al-Bashir and Turabi, that came to power in 1989 till actually last year for Bashir. And the third one is the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. So these are the case studies I use. They all came to power by using different means. One through a revolution, if you can call it it's a revolution / civil war, and this functional society that is the Islamic State. That is, I call that militant Islam, because when we say political Islam, it has 2 branches. One is the moderate political Islam and the militant Islam. So the militant Islam are the Islamic State, Al Qaeda, and its officials. But political Islam are there's a good book by Richard Martin and Abbas on Islamism, if someone is interested in just exploring the differentiations between these groups. But political Islam here, when I use it loosely, it includes both moderate and militant groups. So the case studies I have, 2 are moderate political groups, Islamists, Morsi and Bashir / Turabi, and the Islamic State. This is, militant groups. And I explain why I called it militant Islam, because this is a very deep debate in the studies of modern Islamic groups. You are between those who don't want to name them and those who want to name them. But we are academics. We work in the academy. We have to name things. Unless we can name things, we cannot study them. Without naming, the measurement is impossible. So we there has to be names. Groups have to be names, have to be given, assigned names. Then we can start counting. The beginning of counting is the beginning of science. Without naming, there is no counting, there is no science, there is no methodology. That's why I focus on earlier on to make clear boundaries between entities and groups. What I meant by political Islam, what I meant by militant Islam. Here I draw on John Hope Franklin, the tremendous leading scholar of this past century. And in his book, The Militant South, the Southerners were militant groups. So you see tremendous similarity between how Southerners' militancy was framed and how militant groups, Al Qaeda and its, families, sisters are framed. That's why I revert to militant Islam to account for what others may call extremist group, terrorist group, and so on. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect is my focus on the Arabic-speaking world or the Arab world. So hopefully someone else, when you talk about Islamic polities, the oldest one is Iran and then Afghanistan under the Taliban. So there are other cases. More recently we have in Turkey, maybe, so on. But this is just focus on this part. So that is the second point. The third point is, I also talk about that Islamists, they oppose modern despotic rule and dictatorship, not because they are unjust. for subverting human freedom, and liberties, but because they are unjust for not preserving man's freedom, to submit to God. So a common argument is Islamists, they promote freedom. I say, yes, they do promote freedom, but they don't promote that political freedom for the sake of freedom itself, but for not preserving man's freedom to submit to God. So these are arguments that I made earlier, and it helps us as we go through the book to put things in a context. So going back to your question on the tensions, what I call tensions of political Islam in the book, it is one of the key elements, I think, in the book that I used lived experience and interviews in many areas of the Arabic-speaking Muslim world to look at issues that are really source of tension between Islamists and in society. So I don't think, I'm thinking now in the book I link it primarily with justice. It was more of just pure social science studies of interaction between actors and agent in society. So I talk about Islamist obsession with the state as the center of the Islamization process or project. So I think that's something I focus on. What defines Islamists, I think, wrongfully so, was obsession with the state. And I say the tension is coming from two things here. One, the state in Arab and Muslim countries, and Arab countries in particular, is a new project, a product of colonialism. The state itself has not yet developed its own identity, mechanism of survival or legitimacy. So that I think that itself, and Islamists focusing on the state, causes clash of interests because the state is in the process of remaking itself. If you look at all Arab countries, these are new countries. I mean, look at the Muslim Brotherhood was established in 1928. It is older than all the Arab countries, if you look at it. Only Egypt was, at the time, could be defined as a state. So it's much older. All these Arab countries, they came in 1950s and 60s, basically. Yeah. So it's a new state, Yeah, it's a new state. So the state itself has not developed yet. So that is, I call, source of tension. And I talk about it in detail in the context of the military, because you always have clash between Islamists and the military. So I link this to how the Arab state, Arab/Muslim state was created. It's a product of colonialism. And one of the strongest safeguard of colonialism was the military establishment. Yeah. So that's why you always have clash between Islamists and the military. You have it in Algeria, causing the Algerian civil war. You have in many situations in Mauritania. You have many cases in Sudan. That is historically how Sudan has been defined. And you have it also many cases in Egypt, from Jamal Abdel Nasser up till the current government. So why? Because both of them are claiming or are looking for legitimacy itself. Yeah. So and in most cases, as you see, ordinary people tend to support the military at the expense of the Islamists. There are some reasons that I talk about it for it, and whenever you have this clash, ordinary people tend to support at the end the military. So I talk about that. So the second source of what I call the tensions of political Islam is the lay person, the ordinary Muslims. remember though, the mission of political Islam to bring Sharia is itself problematic, because how Sharia was not developed in a centralized entity. Sharia developed over time in a decentralized setting. What we call tashri' was generally developed in the absence of centralized authority. That's why we have Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi, and you have Malik's disciples saying, al-urf min ad-din, custom is a part of our religion, tashri', because there is no centralized authority. So people have to live their own way of life. So when you claim this Sharia, bring it to the state, it becomes problematic itself, because the state is centralized. That is why An-Nu'aymi's book, is just a must read. That for Sharia to materialize, the state has to be secular, because Sharia itself has, the state tends to centralize, and the Sharia itself is decentralized by itself. Yeah. So the second entity here I talk about is the layperson, the ordinary Muslim. Because most Muslims are apolitical. They're just good citizens for wherever they live. They just want to pay their bills and send their kids to have good education, take care of their neighbors, and so on. So they may be Sufi, they may be tribal, they may have tribal identity, they may so on. Yeah. But a key question, I think, in political Islam, and this is something that takes, in the book, I take a long time to think through and support. Because again, literature matters, written word matters, and this is a tradition of silsila and matna, and what was said and done. So here's where I look at Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, who's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, the mother of the Islamism in the Muslim world. He has some what we call Rasailul Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, or Rasailul Imam, the letters or collection of Sheikh Hassan al-Banna. He codifies actually earlier this relationship vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis the ordinary people. And Sheikh Hassan has a very profound saying, Al-Islam dinun wa dawla wa sayf. This was codified in word and in practice. And he raised, it's a good reading if someone is interested. I'm not sure if it's ever been translated into English, but just look at what should be the relationship between Islamists and the state, the military, Islamists and the layperson. Yeah. So that is what codifies this relationship that has never really changed. Sheikh al-Ghazali attempted later in I think 1960s.
We're talking about Muhammad al-Ghazali, just for not the Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, right?
Yes, Muhammad al-Ghazali. Yeah. He has a book called Dustur al-Wahda al-Thaqafiyya Bayn al-Muslimin, which is like a constitution, a unifying constitution among the Muslims, trying to offer some spirits to Hassan al-Banna's argument about what should be the relationship between Islamists and the state Islamists and the lay person, the ordinary Muslims. It's a very, very deep reading of many possibilities. But this did not really materialize, because Sayyid al-Qutb came in with three fundamental textbooks that shape what this should be. His three major books, Milestone on the Road, Fi Zilal al-Quran, which is in the shadow of the Quran, and Al-Adal, social justice in Islam. In these three books, he really codified what should this relationship be, and makes clear that this is just you're with us or you're against us. Those who are not with the Islamists are in Jahili society. And in the shadow of the Quran, he makes it clear our relationship with the Jahili society is a question of jihad. It's a political violence. Yeah. So this lingers, these tensions, and I argue in the book from two viewpoints, that political Islam, because we talk about within less than 100 years, so this is a very, very, short period. In terms of entities as well as ideas, was never able to free itself from Qutb and Qutb's teaching. You can see, if you look at the militant Islamists, the leadership of militant Islamists, the leading is Az-Zawahiri, is a disciple of Sayyid al-Qutb, actually joined Jamal Islamiyah because in 1966, Sayyid was hanged in Egypt, so he left and he joined the Jamal Islamiyah. And after the war with Israel, 73, Jamal Islamiyah went underground, assassination of Sadat, 81, going to jail and get out from jail, maybe 1987, 88, joining Afghanistan, meeting Bin Laden, the establishment, the call for jihad, 1996, the establishment of Qaeda, 1998. So you actually have entities who have lived with Qutb and move on to take his ideas into practice. So that is militant Islam and the Islamists. In terms of ideas writing, you see.
Professor, if you don't mind me interrupting, because I want to shift the conversation to our case studies.
Right.
Given the time constraint, but before I do that, we have two comments or questions from the audience. So I want to read them to you, and if you could just briefly address them or answer them before we come back to. I want to shift the conversation to the final part of the book, which is the case studies, and particularly I want to focus on Egypt and Sudan.
Right.
I think we talked so far quite a bit about the militant Islam, about Al-Qaeda, now at Al-Zawahiri, Sayyid Qutb, and so on and so forth. I would want to look at the other part of Islamism through the case studies. But before that, let me read. So Ziryab Jambal says, the doctor's conception of justice radically diverges from classical Islamic conceptions, which have justice emanating from full human beings to those considered less than full human beings. I think you have mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the emphasis here is not on Islam per se, it is on political Islam. And I think the concept of justice you were discussing was the concept of justice as understood by political Islamists. Is that here the contention, or is there anything else you would like to add to the comment that Ziryab is posing?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. His question is very good and very relevant. So that's why I was saying earlier in the tension of Islam, how Islam actually developed, highly decentralized. So the conception of that justice, he's offering one viewpoint. Others may offer different viewpoint, but I'm looking at justice within political Islam itself. And remember, I gave you Muslim scholars who also come into new notion of justice based on their understanding of political despotism that, occupy the Muslim land in the last 50, 60 years. So I think we're within the same framework. That's why I warned my colleague earlier on to really read the book. It's very difficult to talk about it in a short setting and get it right, but you need to, definitely. Yeah, but that is a very good question, yes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Like you said, the conception of justice presented in this comment is one conception of justice, right? The one that you are considering in your book is another conception of justice, which is presented in Islamic political thought, both classically as well as in modern times. So I think I hope that clarifies it. The second question we have...
Let me just add to that. And I qualified as literal justice.
Okay.
So the book doesn't only talk about, it is called about literal justice. And there are some, you'll find how literal justice is defined in the book. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The second question is from Professor Mudathir Abdurrahim, who himself, I believe right now is in Khartoum in the Sudan, and he is my professor, so salams and greetings to him. He is my teacher as well. The question that he's asking is actually the one that I also had in mind. So obviously there is an influence of the teacher here, is that when you're talking about, Professor Lo, when you're talking in your book, and you mentioned in your talk, you're focusing on Arab-speaking Muslim countries, And yet what we have one of the most interesting ongoing Islamist experiments is the one of Tunisia. Professor Mudathir is asking, how do you see it? And I would add to it that Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghanouchi has actually written quite a lot on the issue of freedom in Islamic thought, and especially contemporary Islamic thought. So how do you, I know you don't talk about it in the book, you may want to say why you didn't write about it in the book, and then maybe if you have any thoughts to offer on this question and the issue of Tunisia and Harakat al-Nahda over there.
Well, thank you. I know Professor Mudathir Abdul Rahim very well, and I think he was an external reviewer in my master's degree I wrote on African studies. I still remember that Mudathir, Professor.
And my master's degree, he was my supervisor. So
yeah, so we have a connection. I know him very well. He's a tremendous scholar at the University of Khartoum. Yes. So I talk about Tunisia and Sheikh Al-Ghanouchi, whom I know. I met him and I visited Tunisia. I didn't meet him when I visited Tunisia, but I met him in Khartoum. And I interview leading scholars in the Nahda movement. And Ghanouchi's book, Ghanouchi is among the scholars who wrote about actually freedom, which I critique, because he has a book called Al-Hurriyat Al-Amma fi Dawla Al-Islamiyya, Public Freedom in the Islamic State, which I saw very limiting understanding of freedom, why I codify earlier on. Islamists do accept freedom, but they link it with some particular conditions. But the political freedom we talk about has to be unconditional. So why I did not include Tunisia, because here I'm looking at Islamists who came to power and govern. Tunisians did come to power, but at the time, but it wasn't a Nahda party itself. It has, monopoly over the parliament, but the leader Marzouki was not an Islamist. So Tunisia would have spoiled my case study. So I just wanted cases where Islamists came to power and have control over the state, so the polity, like the case of Sudan, Bashir and Turabi, the case of Morsi coming to Egypt for a year, 12 months, and so on. So that is why I did not include Tunisia. But Tunisia is everywhere in the case, in the studies, in interviews, in the ideas of the changing nature of Al-Nahda itself. It's a beautiful experience. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for the answer. Now let's turn to our case studies. Guide us through the Egyptian revolution of 2011-2012, and how did the call for justice and freedom play themselves during the revolution, and especially obviously with specific reference to the political Islamists, primarily the Muslim Brothers, but also the Salafis and all others who have entered into political fray after the revolution. So
can you repeat it again?
So guide us through this Egyptian revolution of 2011-2012, and how did the calls for freedom and justice, and we heard a lot of calls for freedom and justice during that revolution, how did they play out during this revolution, and how did the Islamists participate in that, which led to their eventually emerging the most powerful political player, and were in power for about a year. So guide us through that experience, and how does it connect to your book and to your argument?
Yeah, that is a tough question, and much tougher to answer in limited time, because it is Egypt is Egypt Dunya, as my Egyptian friends and tradition
like to say that, right?
Like to say, yeah. And the Egyptian revolution is just understudied, I think. Because in the academia we have tendency to, when there is a revolution, we study people. We don't we don't go beyond. This goes back to how we study the Haitian Revolution, the Russian, the French Revolution. Yeah, but there are so many books. In Arabic we say "Qutilat bahsan." Egypt was killed by research, because every other research is about the Egyptian Revolution. But I lived through the Egyptian Revolution, because as the director of Duke in the Arab World, I was in every summer in Egypt from 2009. So I lived in Egypt, during the revolution, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. And I was already writing about Egypt when the revolution took place. So I was just blessed to experience the revolution. This is very difficult now because there is a tendency to have revisionism in studying Egypt. That makes it much harder because that's the human nature. We tend to, there's an Arabic saying, people don't honor the current experience, but once it's behind them, they tend to change their mind, to honor it. So the tendency of scholars to go back and revisit Egypt. But what I wrote, even the chapter on Egypt, was a chapter I published 2 weeks after the end of the Morsi's tenure in Egypt. I published it online. It's available under different name because I just didn't want to modify the chapter because so that's what happens here. People have different understanding of Egypt now than it was. So there are 2 or 3 chapters on Egypt in this. I look at Egypt, just the beginning of the revolution, how the revolution started. And I try to have a different framing of it. Using, Karl Baker has a book called the Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers. It's a great book that really tells you sometimes it is good to use language to study political events. So that's what I try to do here. There are so many interpretations. I go back and look at, in Egypt, there were 3 contending legitimacies. You have the Islamists, the non-Islamist revolutionaries, and the militaries. So the question that nagged me over the months was, what's the best way to frame this? Because these are issues of emotion and tension. What's the best way to understand it? That's why I started collecting the language artifacts, meaning what in the Egyptian revolution, during symbols, during Friday manifests, during marches, during journeys, during, what symbolized the support for the military, what symbolizes support for non-Islamist revolution, and what symbolizes Islamist. And then through systematic analysis of these cultural artifacts, I come to divide them between supporters of literal justice and supporters of freedom. So that takes me back to my earlier argument here. And supporters of literal justice are linked with Islamists. Supporters of just absolute freedom, ad-dawla al-madaniyya, in its modern context, were non-Islamist, revolutionaries. So that is how I approach Egypt in this book. That is one. Number 2, there's also a more contentious chapter on Morsi, just studying Morsi itself, where I recycle interviews with Morsi, Morsi's speech, Morsi in the public media, and look at what was the impasse in the Morsi's presidency. So I know when someone is writing that chapter right now, they may write in a different way. That's what most people do. But the chapter was written for 3 continuous days, in the last days of the revolution. And I still believe it gives us a good context. But there are two continuities that you will find in the earlier scholars who wrote about Islamists. The French Roy wrote, earlier on about just globalized Islamism, and the Khaldun Center in Cairo. There are some earlier scholarship in 1980s, 90s about Islamists and talk about what they call intellectual poverty. That is a recurring factor. I found a continuation of it during Morsi's leadership. And that is a major piece in this book. That what I mean by intellectual poverty, though, and I know I read a very good review of the book in some of the scholarly journal, and the reviewer was talking about actually, given the volume of Islamist writing, there is no intellectual poverty. But what intellectual poverty is not, it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. I just think Islamist intellectuals fail to critically assist liberal democracies as lived. And democracy is not a peaceful mean and transfer of power, as we live it now in the US, you and me, we see it. But as Isaiah Berlin has argued, the outcome in free society is always more predictive than the outcome in non-free societies. It is not a zero problem society or system. There is always a problem, but there is a more constructive way of coming to a solution. I think that what I talk about in one key element of the book is what I call about the problem of example. This is a good example of accountability. Accountability in liberal democracy was a major argument during Morsi's leadership. Because I am elected, I am accountable, I am legitimate by virtue of this electoral decision. But that is not absolutely true in public administration theory. So that's where you have the Finder-Frederick debate. Where accountability, is it based on expertise or is it based on electoral processes? Are people legitimate, accountable in their positions because of election or because of their expertise? So it's a deep debate in public administration, public policy. But it was irrelevant in that context. So this is what I call intellectual poverty. It's not about not writing about something, but writing because we Muslims, we are good at Islamic studies, but I may be wrong, but so little in social sciences. So there is a much need to bring social sciences in understanding Muslim societies. That is not there. It's always Islamic studies to understand human behavior. So that is the argument that I think is very central in that chapter, of the book.
No, that's really, I think, very good theoretical foundation for this. And I think you have indicated some things about the Egyptian experience, the revolution and so on. And obviously for people who want more details, there's, I think, 2 or 3 chapters in the book dedicated specifically to Egypt. But since we are getting close to running out of time, and I have left the best for last, and that is the case of Sudan. Obviously, you had studied in the Sudan, as you mentioned, you did your bachelor's and master's degrees there. You lived during the time when al-Bashir and Turabi were together, and maybe later on, I don't know if the fallout happened when you were there, and you may talk a little bit about that. But I want you to reflect on the Sudan's experience, both from the perspective that you take in the book and theoretical perspective, but also maybe give us a little bit of a personal flavor in the sense of how was it living in a polity like that? How was it being a student, a foreigner, so to say? So if you could take maybe a few minutes to talk about this Sudan experience. I know you could probably talk for hours about it, but if you could give us a little bit of a breakdown of this.
Well, that is a tough one. That's a very, very difficult. When you have Professor Mudassir Abdulrahim, so I can talk about Sudan, and while we have him at the other, maybe you should arrange for him to do so. But I lived in Sudan for many years. A great, people, good people, great country, lovable. Tremendous scholarship. In the time I lived in Sudan, that was the time Sudan was going through this process of Islamization. What happens is, that's why I chose Sudan, because how Islamists, the 3 cases I studied, Islamists came to power through revolution, through electoral process, Morsi, and Sudan was a way, based on Turabi's writing, Islamists were disappointed because, what happened in Algeria, Islamists were about to win the elections and the military got in and then there was a coup d'etat. So in the case of Sudan, Turabi decided to work with the military to recruit this general called, al-Bashir to lead a coup d'etat against an elected fair and free elections that brought Sadiq al-Mahdi to power. So in 1989, you have Islamists / military coming to power. For the first time in the Arab, or even in the Muslim world, you can generalize that safely. And then the following years were the years, what I call in the book, a tamkin. So the tamkin goes back to Sayyidul Qutb. Sayyidul Qutb, in the shadow of the Quran, talk about tamkin. Also, he talks about tamkin as a psychological and operational process. Psychological process of Muslims and operational process for a Muslim to come to power. So for Turabi, the earlier years were very, very drastic, very, very. I am always for, I think humans are better when they're free. This is something I believe, maybe, growing up in Senegal before I know anything. I think that's why I'm always support freedom. I think we as human, whether Muslim or non-Muslim or whatever, we are better under freedom than under anything else. So that was my tension with the whole project of Islamization and Tamkin. So I talk about in the book how it came, and a year later, I think the founders of Al-Qaeda later were invited to come to Sudan. And besides the changing nature, Sudan became the center of the global Islamist, movement. And I talk about, in a different book I wrote, I think, called Understanding the Muslim Discourse, Language, Tradition, and the Message of Bin Laden. There's a chapter there on a conference that was organized to look at how do we approach the issue of freedom. You have Islamists were divided into 3 groups: Islamize democracy, democratize Islam, reject democracy. So this was the good representation of how Turabi al-Bashir struggled for almost 30 years. And the result was drastic for Sudan. The civil war in Darfur, thousands of people were killed. Among Darfurian are Muslims, and civil war in South, and at the end the South went its own way and became an independent entity. So Sudan is a very sad case in this, where just the drastic failure of political Islam, not only in offering justice, which they came to offer, but is even dismantling the existing nation state itself. I hope this does help, but I'm hoping people will read the chapter and learn more about Sudan through it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And I can see even some sort of a personal anguish when you're talking about this, because obviously you lived through this. And it reminded me, when I was a student in the 90s in Malaysia, and this is where I studied with Professor Mudethe. He was teaching in Malaysia at the time. There was an Islamization process going on, but Islamists were not in power. The Islamization process was done by political parties that were nationalists with Muslim orientation. They did it for a number of reasons why they adopted Islamization policies, and it's not time and place to discuss that right now. But it is an interesting kind of comparative case between, let's say, Sudan and Malaysia, where you have Islamization process in both countries, but in one, it's led by the Islamists, in the other, it's led by non-Islamists, you can say. And actually, non-Islamists have done, I think, overall a better job of doing Islamization than the Islamists themselves. So I think that's an interesting comparative case. I think we have 2 more questions, and I think we'll take these 2 questions, and with that, we're going to try to end. So Rushda Siddiqui is asking, Doctor has talked about political freedoms, justice, and the issue of Islamic State. Would he care to comment on the concept of social justice playing a role in shaping these concepts? So that's the question. Would you care?
Can you read it again?
Yeah. So it says, would you comment on the concept of social justice playing a role in shaping these concepts, meaning the concepts of political freedom and justice?
The concept of social justice. I have to admit that I'm not familiar with social justice. Just a matter of framing. I know in the yeah, I have to admit.
Yeah, I'm also not sure. Does it as a social justice here? The question, social justice understood. Now we hear a lot of calls for social justice in Western society, especially in the United States, when it comes to racism, equality, treatment of African Americans, people, brown people, black people, and so on. Is it that kind of social justice or something else? But there is a follow-up question. I think this one, you may be...
Yeah, I want to say that wouldn't be called social justice.
Okay.
They don't call it. I mean, there are language that are used often in the social media. It is incorrect, like social justice. It just doesn't mean anything. But the issue of equality, that's language. But I don't get it. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. There is a follow-up question. I think this one is more in line with your own research. How do you view the massive external intervention in West Asia and Africa as shaping the discourses of the Islamists that you have studied? So how has the external intervention in Asia and Africa shaped the discourses of the Islamists, which you have studied?
That is a great question. I mean, external intervention. I'm assuming what he means here is whether it is military or even just the global neoliberal market. I think, Adam Haniya has a very good book that called something Lineages of Revolt, I think. That's the only book I saw that give a neoliberal understanding of the Arab Revolution. The argument he's making is actually the cause of the Arab Revolution was inequality produced by neoliberal forces. Just a beautiful study that offer quantified data to support it. So, and I argue in many areas that, neoliberalism is also, because this is the latest stages of capitalism are neoliberal policies and globalization. And they cause tremendous inequality. Inequality of neoliberalism is inequality within communities itself. I mean, growing up in Senegal, I know you don't see someone very rich next door, So that is the type, but nowadays that is the norm. Within society have tremendous inequality. But global human community is richer, wealthier, living longer, but breakdown of society is deeper. You go to Egypt, you find it. You go to, these are places I'm familiar with, Sudan, Senegal, and, Yemen, and so on. So this is the problem that when we talk about linking between militant political Islam generally and its justice message and neoliberal policies which produce inequality and freedom. This is the link that how freedom, what I call the freedom agenda and the justice project clash. And you see it in Iraq actually and in Nigeria. That's a good two case studies. And this is away from the military intervention. I'm just talking about economic inequality that really played itself in Iraq, in Nigeria. And then groups in this context, they revert into tradition, into what they know. Remember, Alex de Tocqueville told us that human will choose to live in servitude with equality than in freedom with inequality. Just the human nature. So in these cases, and even I show where most of these, militant groups in West Africa, historically they came from caste societies that were deemed as enslaved groups. So you can look at it from many ways, just to look at how the problem that we're facing now really has roots in not only military intervention, which we often, that's a study that came out to show that 30 million of people were displaced in the Middle East due to American intervention since the war in Iraq. But beyond that, neoliberal policies, that just dismantle society and wealth has deep negative ramification in making people turn to find new solutions in radical ways and radical corners, including the Islamic militancy.
Okay. Thank you. And we have one final question. Actually, the question was retracted on YouTube, but actually it's a great question to finish on. So I'm going to borrow it, and I hope the questioner wouldn't mind, because it was in line with what I wanted to ask. So final question. Given this failure of political Islam that you write about in your book, what's next? What do you think political theology in Islam or Islamic political thought could or should look like in the coming period?
That's a great question. That is chapter 9 of the book. In chapter 9, I say beyond freedom and beyond justice. Freedom and justice don't mean anything if they don't bring prosperity, if they don't bring peace, if they don't bring love, if they don't bring cohesiveness in society. So that's why last chapter of the book is called Beyond Freedom and Beyond Justice. And there where I revert back to Islam, there is and Islam is about ihsan. And you have so many, remember our friends, the Syrian book also, who argue that, Islamic Quran is Islamic ulama, how Islam was actually displaced from the Quran to the ulama. So the Islam we are living is Islam that was produced by scholars like me and you over time. Everything go back to hadith and don't go back to the Quran. So I argue that actually Islam is about ihsan, not about, if you look at just the power of force, powerhouse, why Islam was accepted globally and appeal to human nature was because it's the power of just human nature, ethics. But as political Islam becomes political in opposing the West, which as I argue in the earlier chapters of the book, is everything was about freedom, not about ethics and justice. So in countering that, political Islam become like the Western liberal tradition that it came to fight against. It also focused on politics at the expense of issues of ihsan, ethics, which is at the center of it. So I think in the Muslim context, Muslims, this is something people need to address. How do you bring ihsan? I know our friend, Professor Khan wrote that book about ihsan and governance. These are great work of scholarship.
I was just going to mention it, yeah.
Yes, people need to look at. So the critique is just to make people rethink, because I talk about earlier on in that chapter, last chapter, that writing matters. It matters more in Islam, and that is where the need of writing that address issues of reforming Muslim society should come about. How revisit values of that are missing in society nowadays. I think that is where we should go, and that is, I think, where we are heading as we reform this, the impasse that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So the reform is never ending and always ongoing, and we are sure to see, I think, in the coming period, new attempts in trying to reconceptualize what politics means, what the Muslim polity should look like, and it's all happening within broader structures, which is really the point I really liked so much about your book, that you start with that broader structure, that we live in the time of neoliberal globalization, that this is a huge economic and political project, and that Muslim polities are developed or being developed or are trying to develop themselves within that framework. I think that is always important to remember and not to forget. So I want to thank you once again for this wonderful conversation. I would like to thank our audience for being with us. And please check our website from time to time for latest developments with the center and the new events that we are planning. And once again, Professor Lo, thank you so much for your time. All the best.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, and have a nice day.
Wow. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
You're most welcome.